Hello, and welcome back to this survey of the Old Testament. In the next few sessions, I want to give a brief outline of the main sections and books of the Old Testament. Now, again, in a survey of this kind, there's a great deal that I won't be able to deal with. I have covered these things in a little more detail in my Old Testament introduction, and there are references there to other books and articles that you might want to look at. Most of what we looked at already is also either there or in my Old Testament theology. Both are published by Apollos. Okay, so that's enough of a plug. I do hope, though, that what we can look at in these sessions will give at least an overview of the main issues. Now, in the first of these sessions, I want to focus on the Pentateuch and the former prophets. We'll begin with the Pentateuch, which in the Hebrew Bible is referred to as Torah, the Hebrew word for law. Now, the Pentateuch, as we've already seen, comprises the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. As the name Torah suggests, it includes substantial legal sections which relate to the social, personal, and religious well-being of the nation. Now, this legal material is set within a narrative telling the story from the creation of the world to the point where the people are ready to enter and take possession of the promised land. There are also links with other ancient Near Eastern literature, including creation and flood stories. Now, it's the traditional view that the Pentateuch was written by Moses around about the time of the Exodus. And there are certainly clear links with Moses. There are references to Moses receiving revelation from God. The Old Testament also refers frequently to the law of Moses. And the law is associated with Moses too in the New Testament. A more common view these days, though, is that it was written later than the time of Moses. And it may not have been set out in the way that we have it until the Babylonian exile. The exile was a formative time in Israel's history as the people tried to come to terms with the loss of the temple and the land and what that meant for their relationship with God. However, whilst the crisis of the exile may have led to key theological ideas being set out more clearly, and on balance, that is the view that I take, it seems likely too that many of those ideas were already present much earlier and would have been passed on either in writing or by word of mouth. And it's certainly possible that some go back to Moses. Now, the Pentateuch begins with what is often referred to as the primeval history in Genesis 1 to 11. Now, there is considerable debate about these chapters. Did God literally create the heavens and the earth in 6 days? Were Adam and Eve real figures? Was there really a universal flood? Some argue that there is no reason to take this as anything other than a literal account of what happened. And certainly it is true that God could have created the world in 6 days. There are, though, a few problems, such as where Cain's wife came from, and the very high ages, particularly of those who lived before the flood, where average life expectancy seems to have been in excess of 900 years. Others suggest that Genesis 1 to 11 is perhaps not historical. It uses language similar to what we find in other ancient Near Eastern accounts, particularly those relating to the creation and to a flood. And it's intended to give a theological explanation of the way things are. The emphasis is more on global issues, including the sovereignty of God as creator, the significance of human beings, male and female, and their place within creation. These chapters also include fundamental issues that affect human life: sin, death, marriage, conflict within families, conflict between nations, human development, the origin of different languages. These chapters also introduce key peoples and places that will play a part in the story later. The fall in Genesis 3 points to universal sin, and it explains the idea that is widespread in the Old Testament, that things are not as they should be. Now, in my view, it is better to focus on the theological significance of these chapters rather than become caught up in arguments about whether they should be understood literally or not. Now, in the opening chapters of this section, we see the creation of the heavens and the earth, including the creation of human beings and God's verdict on his finished work. God saw that all that he had made, and it was very good. Human beings, though, were not satisfied with their lot. They wanted to be like God. They wanted to take control of their own lives. And so in Genesis 3, we have the fall and their expulsion from the Garden of Eden. There is then a further decline into sin, culminating in the flood and God's decision to wipe out all flesh, except for Noah and his family and the birds and animals that were kept safe in the ark. With Noah, there is a new start. Though after the flood, the decline into sin continues, leading to the Tower of Babel, where human beings build a tower in an attempt to reach God and to control God. Things then take a more positive turn, and we're introduced to Terah, the father of Abraham. Now, as we turn to Genesis 12 to 50, we have the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. I've already said that these stories have a more historical feel, and I take them as factual accounts. Abraham traveled from Ur, first to Haran and then to Canaan. And there in Canaan, God promised that his descendants would take possession of the land. Now, this promise is embodied in a covenant, what is often called the Abrahamic covenant. We'll say more about that when we look at the theme of covenant in a later session. The idea of descendants at first seemed impossible, especially as Abraham and his wife Sarah became older. But then Isaac was born. Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau was the older, but Jacob tricked Esau out of his rights as firstborn and became Isaac's heir. He was then renamed Israel, and his sons were the heads of what became the 12 tribes of Israel. The story of Jacob then continues with his then favorite son Joseph being sold as a slave by his brothers and taken to Egypt. There, Joseph rose to prominence, became second in command to Pharaoh, the king in Egypt. And Genesis ends with Jacob's family joining Joseph in Egypt. And that's where Exodus picks things up. We see the oppression of Jacob's descendants by the Egyptians, who became afraid of them. We see there too the call of Moses, the plagues that eventually persuaded Pharaoh to let the people go, the first Passover, deliverance at the Red Sea, the miraculous provision on the journey. Exodus 19:1 through to Numbers 1:10 describes Israel at Mount Sinai, where God made a covenant with them and took them as his own special people. He gave them the 10 Commandments and more detailed instructions for worship and for their life together. They also built the tabernacle, symbolizing God's presence among them. And when the tabernacle was completed, it was filled with the glory of God. The instructions given at Sinai continue in the book of Leviticus. These include instructions for sacrifices, the appointment of Aaron as Israel's first high priest and his family, his sons, as priests. There are food and purification laws and the holiness code, which we've mentioned already, which also includes instructions for key festivals. The book of Numbers begins with a census or a numbering of the people. That's where the name Numbers comes from, while they were still at Sinai. Now, the list of 12 tribes there does not include Levi. They were from the tribe from which the priests came, and they were set apart from the others. But to keep the number at 12, Joseph was replaced by tribes named after his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. The first chapters of Numbers then continue with regulations about the role of priests and Levites. Now in Numbers 10:11, we read that the people set out from Sinai and their journey continues to the end of the book of Deuteronomy, where they are camped just outside the promised land. Now when they first arrived at Canaan between 1 and 2 years after leaving Egypt, they sent spies to explore the land. And it certainly was a good land, but the inhabitants were strong. And with the exception of Caleb and Joshua, the people were afraid and they refused to go in. Now that resulted in continued wandering for another 38 years until that generation had died. In Numbers 26, there is a second census, and that marks a turning point and the rise of a new generation that can make the final stage of the journey. Now in Deuteronomy, the people have reached the plains of Moab, which is to the east of the River Jordan, and they are preparing to enter the promised land, which is on the other side of the river. Moses won't be going with them. So what we have in Deuteronomy is, in effect, Moses' final words to the people before they embark on their new life. He recounts some of the history of the journey, and there is a repetition of some of the laws. There is also a significant emphasis on the land. And if the people want to remain in the land and enjoy its blessings, then there is the emphasis on the importance of obedience. And here we see what is sometimes called the two ways, that obedience leads to life and blessing, disobedience leads to death, disaster, defeat, and eventual exile from the land. Now we'll come back to that. Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch end with the death of Moses and the appointment of Joshua as Israel's leader. Now, let me just make one further point. Deuteronomy is associated with the book of the law that was found in the temple during the reign of Josiah in the 7th century BC, and which prompted Josiah's religious reforms. The implication is that this had been lost and had now been discovered, though some argue that it had just been written and had been planted there. And this is part of the debate about when the Pentateuch was written. Let's turn now to some of the Pentateuch's key themes. A central theme of the Pentateuch is the fulfillment of God's promises to the patriarchs, especially to Abraham. God made a covenant with Abraham. He promised Abraham that he would become a great nation, that he and his descendants would know God and would be given possession of the land. And although the people are not yet in Canaan, those promises are close to fulfillment. Now, some argue that the book of Joshua should be linked with the Pentateuch because that goes on to include the possession of the land. The fulfillment of the promises to the patriarchs is clearly an important theme here, but it doesn't cover the whole of the Pentateuch. What do we do with the first 11 chapters? Now, I've already hinted that Genesis 1 to 11 does hold another key theme, that God's good creation was spoilt by human sin. And we see that decline culminating first in the flood and then in the Tower of Babel. Now, let me elaborate on that for a moment. Now, in the beginning, we're told, the earth was formless and empty. The Hebrew term is tohu vabohu. In particular, it is covered with water, described as the deep. Now, I usually refer to this pre-creation situation as chaos. Now, that may not be the best word, and some don't care much for it, but I can't think of a better one. In his act of creation, God transformed that watery chaos into something very good. But then we have the fall. And when we look especially at the flood, we see how human sin has allowed the waters of chaos to return. It's a kind of uncreation, going back to something like the way things were before they were transformed by God. Not quite the same, but we see again waters covering the earth. Now, following the flood, the waters were dried up, and this may be viewed as a kind of recreation. God did not give up on his world, and he preserved Noah and the people and animals and birds with him in the ark. And after the flood, God renewed his commitment to the world and made a covenant with Noah and with his descendants and with every living creature. It was a new beginning, but things were not back to the way they were, and the decline into sin continues. Now, the story of Abraham from Genesis 12 onwards points to the way back. And the promise in Genesis 12:3 that through Abraham, all people on earth will be blessed, points again to God's commitment and that his purpose includes the whole world. Now, if God's interest is in the whole world, the fulfillment of the promise to the patriarchs is then only part of the story. It is a means to an end. God chose Abraham and through him the nation of Israel in the Old Testament to be a blessing to the whole of creation and to the means through which the created order was restored to what it was meant to be. Now we see this too in Exodus 19 verses 5 and 6, where God's people are chosen as his treasured possession so that they may serve him as a kingdom of priests. Now the priest in Israel was an intermediary. He represented the people before God and God before the people. Now Israel too was called to be an intermediary between God and the whole earth, which also belongs to him. And we may see the role of the church today in a similar way. Now we'll say more about this when we look at the theme of mission in the Old Testament. But let's turn now to the former prophets. This section of the Hebrew Bible comprises the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And these tell the story of Israel from the entry into Canaan under Joshua to the Babylonian exile. Now, we've already noted some of the historical details. When the Babylonians finally destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, many would have asked the question, how could God let this happen? Wasn't he the faithful God that they could rely on? And these books, the former prophets, give an account of Israel's history in such a way as to explain why. As we've seen, the book of Deuteronomy sets out the two ways. Obedience brings blessing, disobedience brings defeat and eventual exile from the land. And that principle is being worked out in Israel's history. And the answer to the question, why did God let it happen, is that this was just what they had been warned about. God was not being unfaithful, just the opposite. He was being entirely faithful to his word. Now, this principle is evident, for example, in what happened at Jericho and at the next city that the Israelites came to, Ai. Obedience resulted in an unexpected victory at Jericho. Disobedience led to an equally unexpected defeat at Ai. The principle also runs right through the book of Judges, and we'll come to that in a moment. Josiah, one of Judah's best kings, is described as one who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his strength in accordance with the law of Moses. And that may have offered brief hope. But after his death, the people did not follow in his ways, and so they went into exile. So let's look at an outline of the former prophets. The book of Joshua describes the conquest of the land. It begins with Joshua's call to the unenviable task of taking over from Moses. He took them across the Jordan on dry ground through a miracle that would have reminded him and the people of Moses leading the people across the Red Sea, which was also on dry ground. Following that, they celebrated the Passover, and for the first time, they ate the fruit of their new land. As they pressed on into the land, next came the remarkable victory at Jericho, as we have seen, and following that, the equally surprising defeat at Ai. Now, much of the rest of the book of Joshua describes victories over the inhabitants of Canaan, though there are frequent reminders that there is still more to do. So, for example, following the defeat of Canaanite kings in Joshua 10 to 12, we're told that even when Joshua was still old, there was still large areas of land to be taken over. And when the land is allocated to the tribes, some found it difficult to dislodge all of the inhabitants. The book ends with Joshua's farewell. Now, this includes his challenge to the people: choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, and a renewal of the covenant. Now, the book of Judges is set during the early days of the settlement after the death of Joshua and his fellow elders. And there appears there to be a real crisis of leadership. Without good leaders, the people turned from God, and in accordance with the 2 ways in Deuteronomy, they experienced defeat by their enemies. When they cried out to God, he then sent them a leader who delivered them from their enemies. These were called judges because they had a judicial as well as a military role. During the lifetime of the judge, the people worshipped God, but when the judge died, they turned away again, and the cycle repeated. The books of Samuel begin with Samuel's birth, his dedication, and his call. Now, the setting here is the continued threat from the Philistines. Samuel achieved some success against the Philistines, and it may be that as he grew old, the people wanted another national figure to lead them as he had done. And so they asked for a king. Now, up to this point, God had been seen as their king, and looking for a more prominent human leader was viewed as a rejection of God's leadership. Even so, God gave them what they asked for, and the monarchy was instituted with Saul as Israel's first king. Now, Saul achieved some victories, but he was ultimately rejected because of his disobedience. Now, this led to David being anointed. His famous encounter with Goliath brought him into the spotlight, and it led to conflict between him and Saul. 1 Samuel ends with Saul's death, and 2 Samuel deals mainly with David. First, he is anointed as king over Judah, his own tribe, and this then leads to fighting with Saul's house, which was still in control in the north. David was then recognized by the northern tribes as well, and he became king over all Israel. David captured Jerusalem from the Jebusites, and he made it his capital. He also brought the Ark of the Covenant there, and in that way made Jerusalem the political and the religious center of Israel. Now, God promised David that through him, he would establish a royal dynasty which would never end. And that points to the coming Messiah, who is closely linked with David. We'll say more about that when we look at future hope in the Old Testament. Now, David also defeated neighboring peoples, and he established a significant empire. Now, beginning of 1 Kings describes the death of David, and after a brief power struggle, the accession of Solomon as king. Now, Solomon is noted for several things. At the outset of his reign, he asked God for wisdom, and he became internationally famous for his wisdom, though there were points in his reign where his actions don't appear to have been very wise. Solomon also built and dedicated the temple in Jerusalem. And when that happened, we're told that just as with the tabernacle in Moses' day, the glory of God filled the temple. Solomon was also noted for his great wealth. Less commendable was the number of his wives. One of the things we see in the Old Testament is that polygamy was fairly common. Jacob had 2 wives, Leah and Rachel. David had several wives, and so perhaps not surprising that Solomon had more than 1 wife, though by any standard, 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines is excessive. A concubine, just to explain, did not have the same legal status as a wife, though their rights were nevertheless protected in the law, and their children could inherit alongside the children of official wives. Now, polygamy and having concubines is not explicitly condemned in the Old Testament, but it rarely ends well. In the case of David, it led to conflict between half-siblings and problems with the succession. With Solomon, his foreign wives worshipped other gods, and he worshipped with them. And this turned him away from God. And that is given as the reason for the division of the kingdom after his death. Solomon was succeeded by Rehoboam. At that time, the northern tribes felt aggrieved at the way they had been treated under Solomon, and so they sent a delegation to Rehoboam to ask for better treatment. He refused to listen, and as a result, the northern tribes separated and were ruled over by Jeroboam. As we've seen, the northern tribes were known as Israel or Ephraim, after the name of the largest northern tribe. Judah in the south remained loyal to David's house. Now, the rest of the book of Kings takes us from the division of the kingdom to the Babylonian exile. Key points in this narrative are the ministry of the prophets Elijah and Elisha. Elijah is perhaps best known for his contest with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel during the reign of Ahab. This highlights the growing problem of Baal worship in Israel. And this was a factor in the fall of Samaria and of the northern kingdom to the Assyrians, in line again with the 2 ways in Deuteronomy. In Judah, some of the notable points include the reign of Hezekiah. As we have already noted, he was one of Judah's better kings, and during his reign we see the Assyrian invasion and the miraculous deliverance of Jerusalem. Now, that deliverance depended on putting his trust in God, but when he took pride in his own achievements, in particular showing envoys from Babylon around his capital and taking a real pride in what he had to show them, there is a warning about the coming exile. Hezekiah was succeeded by Manasseh, one of Judah's better kings. Hezekiah replaced by arguably the worst, Manasseh, and the blame for the coming exile is laid firmly at Manasseh's door. Another of Judah's better kings, as we have again already seen, was Josiah. He carried out extensive religious reforms, prompted to some extent at least by the discovery of the law book, which is usually identified with the book of Deuteronomy in the temple. The former prophets end with the fall of Jerusalem, followed by a slightly more positive postscript describing Jehoiakim, Israel, Judah's last king, being released from prison. Now, as we turn to the themes of the former prophets, we've already noted that one key theme is linked to providing an explanation for the exile. Another is God's continuing patience based on his promises to David. When God might have brought an earlier judgment on the people, he held back. And that is also one of the reasons given for the deliverance of Jerusalem from the Assyrians under Sennacherib. I will defend this city and save it for my sake, and for the sake of David, my servant. After the release of Jehoiakim in 2 Kings 25, 27 to 30, we see another suggestion that the exile is not the end of the story, and it offers a glimmer of hope of the eventual restoration of David's line. This promise that David's throne shall be established forever, as I've said, provides the basis for the hope of a Messiah from the line of David. Now, after the division of the kingdom, people from the north still went to worship in Jerusalem. Jeroboam was worried that they might be tempted to turn back to Rehoboam, so he set up 2 shrines of his own, one in the south of Israel at Bethel and one in the far north at Dan. In those shrines, he placed golden calves, like the golden calf that the people had worshipped in the desert. Now, some think that these calves might have been intended as pedestals for God rather than gods themselves, much as the Ark of the Covenant was. God appeared over the Ark of the Covenant. They didn't worship the Ark itself. The problem for Jeroboam was, though, that the Canaanite god Baal was depicted as a bull. And whatever his original intentions, it wasn't long before these shrines, particularly the one at Bethel, were associated with Baal worship. And by setting up these idols, Jeroboam led Israel to sin. And that became his epitaph and is frequently mentioned through the book of Kings. Kings of Israel are often judged because they walked in the ways of Jeroboam. In Judah, the more positive model of kingship is David, and kings there are judged according to whether or not they walked in the ways of David. Another important theme in these books is the importance of prophets who hold the kings of Israel and Judah accountable. We see this, for example, in the relationship between Samuel and Saul, between Nathan and David, and between Elijah and Ahab. There is emphasis too in these books on the fulfillment of prophecy, and this is highlighted in several passages. Announcing what is going to happen and then fulfilling that prophecy is something that demonstrates God's control over history. And the rise and fall of the kings of Israel and Judah, as well as of other nations and even of world empires, is in his hands. And that seems an appropriate place to pause. In the next session, we'll look at the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. And following that, we'll look at the writings. Thanks again for listening. I will see you soon.